Leader of the third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. In 2021, this government appointed the Technical Advisory Panel to identify at-risk old-growth ecosystems and prioritise areas for deferral. Last week, leaked mapping data revealed that bureaucrats removed 55% of the large-treed old-growth areas from deferral, and then substantially increased deferrals in areas with smaller and less commercially valuable trees. It is devastating and yet utterly predictable to learn that the Ministry of Forests did not follow the advice of the scientists this government tasked with identifying the most at-risk old growth in this province. But most of all, this is a failure of leadership. The rest of the world and future generations are counting on us to save the very little rare old growth that is left in BC. This government made a promise in 2020 to the people of BC to protect old growth. Here we are 4 years later, and that promise is not being kept. My question is to the Premier. Why should anyone believe what this government says when it comes to protecting old growth trees?
Minister of Forests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no doubt that people in British Columbia feel a deep affinity for our forests and the ecological systems that support our forest throughout the province. What we committed to in the Old Growth Strategic Review was to take the advice of the Technical Advisory Committee, and indeed 1.2 million hectares were set aside. That being done, then the next step in the process, according to recommendation number 1 of the Old Growth Strategic Review, was to consult with First Nations. In that process, while some First Nations supported a TAP, Technical Advisory Panel, identified deferrals, others said that based on their expertise, local knowledge, alternative old growth land outside of TAP should be deferred instead. Some First Nations don't support proposed deferrals at all and prefer to continue forest activity within their territory, and we respect that decision. So we will keep taking action alongside of First Nations, communities and advocates and the sector to conserve more ancient forests for our children and grandchildren and to support a sustainable approach to forestry.
Leader of the third party supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. It's so fascinating how the government will say it respects the decisions of First Nations, but the nations that have said that they don't want logging of old growth in their territories, those decisions are harder for this government to respect. The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives is accusing the Ministry of Forests of institutional capture. Environmental leaders and former high-ranking civil servants call it a betrayal in the making. After nearly 2 centuries of industrial logging by timber companies, blaming First Nations for not protecting old-growth forests while offering nothing in this budget for conservation financing is simply terrible. Again, an absolute failure of leadership. Conservation financing is necessary to achieve the paradigm shift that this government committed to. My question is to the Premier. Will he put enough conservation financing on the table so that the last old growth of the province has a chance to stay standing?
Minister of Water and Land.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was very proud to join with many members of our government with respect to the question of conservation financing and sign a protocol, a tripartite protocol, as my colleagues would know, between ourselves, the federal government, and First Nations here in BC. I believe the largest conservation package in this country's history. More than $1 billion in contributions from the philanthropic sector, from the province and the federal government, to be able to enable the conservation initiatives that my friend talks about. We have the greatest biodiversity of any province in this country. That also means we have the greatest responsibility with respect to the protection of that biodiversity. There's a number of initiatives I could articulate, but on the specific effort of conservation financing, we put forward $150 million. That was matched by $150 million in private money, and this is just the beginning. Our ability to stand up the conservation initiatives that Indigenous leaders are looking for will be enabled by these significant contributions. There's more to come. This is exciting work, and I think it is work that is legacy building for all of us collectively on behalf of the citizens of this province.